Very good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for joining our Offshore Wind Cluster Builder launch event. My name is Jaya Calder from High, and I'm helping my colleagues run the webinar. Now, before I pass on to Ian, just a little bit of housekeeping. Although we can't see you and you're automatically muted, we actively encourage your involvement. So as an audience member, you'll see a question box. Please pop all your questions, comments, or anything that you would like to chat with us throughout the webinar. That will come to myself, and I'll make sure that our speakers have it. And the other thing, just to advise, is we're recording today's session. So I'd like to pass on to Ian. Ian.
Thanks, Gia. Right, I'd like to start by welcoming you all to today's session, the launch event for the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder Service. As Gia says, I'm Ian MacDonald. I'm one of the specialists in Scottish Enterprise's low carbon transition team. And together with my colleague, Lindsay McHugh, we're going to be facilitating today's session. Before I hand over to the presenters, I'd just like to give you my take on the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder Service and what we're seeking to achieve with the project. Fundamentally, the project is there to help more Scottish companies take advantage of opportunities in the offshore wind sector. You're going to hear from Lara Jurgens at Exos Group, who will give you details of the activities of Cluster Builder Service. But before we get into that, at its core, what we're trying to do with the Cluster Builder is to create visibility of the opportunities in the offshore wind sector and the support that's available to companies to help access those opportunities, and also as well to create greater visibility of all the great capabilities that exist across Scotland's offshore wind sector to the likes of developers, tier ones, and other key supply chain companies. Before we go into the details of the Cluster Builder project itself, though, we're going to hear from David Stevenson, Head of Offshore Wind Policy and Supply Chain at the Scottish Government, who's going to give us his perspective on some of the key barriers and opportunities to supply chain development, offshore wind supply chain development in Scotland. Some of which we're looking to address via the Cluster Builder, perhaps not the ones that necessarily cost millions and millions of pounds, because that's slightly beyond our project budget. After David, we're going to hear from Paul O'Brien, who is the Cluster Manager from Deepwind, who's going to give us an update on some of the activities taking place via Deepwind, and also as well just give us his view on how he sees Deepwind working potentially with the Cluster Builder project. After Paul, we're going to hear from David Webster, who's the brand new chair of Forth and Tay Offshore, who's going to give you a preview of some of the activities we've been undertaking at Forth and Tay to really showcase all the great breadth of capabilities that exist within the Forth and Tay region for offshore wind. After the cluster presentations, they're going to move on to presentations from colleagues at Exos Group, who SE is contracted to help deliver the Cluster Builder service. So we'll hear from Lara Jurgens, market analyst at Exos, who's going to talk about some of the launch activities that we're looking to begin the Cluster Builder service with. We're then going to hear from Elson Martins, who's going to talk about a new offshore wind supply chain survey that's looking to map the capabilities across the Scottish offshore wind supply chain and kind of garner some of, or rather capture some of the views of across the industry, which will be used to help shape the Cluster Builder service going forward. Following the presentations, we'll then move on to a Q&A session. We're going to be joined by Shona Clive, who's the even newer Cluster Manager for Forth and Tay Offshore, and Scott Hamilton, who's the Renewables Division Manager for Exos Group. As Jay mentioned at the start, we are looking to make today's session as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions for any of the panelists, please do use the chat box and I'll endeavour to answer those at the end of the session. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, David Stevenson, who is Head of Offshore Wind Policy and Supply Chain at Scottish Government. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ian, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. As Ian says, I'm David Stevenson. I'm Head of Offshore Wind Policy and Supply Chain within the Scottish Government, working within the Directorate for Energy and Climate Change. I thought I'd be given this opportunity just to give you a broad overview of what has happened in the past few weeks. Obviously, in Scotland here, we've had a Scottish election, and the new government has been in post for approximately 6 weeks. So I thought I'd give you a brief overview of that, and then also then just touch on key documents that have, I suppose, set the scene and will set the scene going forward in the supply chain space here, not just in Scotland, but in the broader of the wider of the UK. So without further ado, obviously, as I said, the Scottish Government came into power on the 6th of May after the Scottish elections there. Obviously, it is the same administration that was in post, if you like, for the last 5 years. But however, there have been obviously a number of changes, which I just thought I would talk you through going forward. So obviously there isn't a Minister for Energy. Obviously Mr Wheelhouse unfortunately lost his seat, and as a result there's obviously been a wee bit of restructuring. So it's not a devaluation of the ministerial post, it's actually an escalation of the post now that Mr Matheson has energy in his title. So he is now the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero Energy and Transport. Beneath him, there are a couple of other ministers. There is a Minister for Transport who will pick up the day-to-day activity, I guess, of that portfolio. And also there's Richard Lockhead, who is looking at net zero. But as I said, clear thing to point out here is there's not a devaluation of energy within the Scottish Government. It is actually an escalation of that into the Cabinet post in his title. The agenda for offshore wind and supply chain has not changed at all. The targets are still very much there. Obviously, we have our net zero target to push on to 2045, and hence why that's been incorporated into Mr. Matheson's title. It has great prominence now, and the agenda that we will be looking forward in both in this parliamentary term and obviously for a few decades to come to actually get there. We also have quite a key element on the flip side of that coin on the supply chain, on the Cabinet post for Finance and Economy led by Kate Forbes. This is very much a key agenda for the government to maximise the benefit that is coming from offshore wind going forward. And both my own role, I certainly report to both Cabinet Secretaries in the high importance of trying to ensure not just in ScotWind, which is coming obviously in the next few years, but also in the current projects they have around our coastline and more to come within the up and coming CFD auctions. So as the slide shows in front, I thought I would just briefly touch on a lot of the key documents that have been in circulation for a while, and obviously bring you also up to date on where we are. So one of the key documents there is one in the top right hand corner, top and left hand corner, sure, I'm trying to work out here, but the offshore wind policy statement. That is obviously was published in the late October last year, along with the sectoral marine plan, the document on the top right there. That pretty much set the scene for where this offshore wind is going to head, as the first bullet there says, out to 2030, with a target of at least 11 gigawatts of offshore wind set out within that document. The key other thing is obviously we want to create as many jobs as possible, and there is a target of 6,000 jobs there at this moment in time. There is roughly around about 4,000 just over, I think, kind of a 50-50 split between construction and those that are also currently working in the wider sphere of offshore wind. But there is certainly a great potential to deliver a lot more. I think 6,000 is obviously our initial target, but hopefully we can deliver a lot more than that. As set out in the sectoral marine plan at the same time as in October last year, there was 15 sites identified within ScotWind that hopefully will deliver up to obviously 10 gigawatts of offshore wind. So obviously slightly below the other target, but obviously we have other projects that are hoping to compete in the forthcoming CFD auction later in this year that will hopefully get us well on track to achieving those targets by the end of the particular decade. And the other two documents, I guess, is the bottom two there, which are quite key. The bottom left is obviously the industrial strategy published by the UK government a number of years, a couple of years ago now, but obviously it set out a key target there of 60% by 2030. The key point there is obviously increasing that target from roughly, I guess, around about maybe the mid to high 40s at this moment in time. But one of the key phrases within that document is over the lifetime of the project. We do quite well in the planning phase, the delivery phase of the project, and also the operation and maintenance phase. But the government has a key agenda here to ensure that we deliver more in the capex phase of this, which is roughly about, at the moment, maybe the high teens, low 20% in amongst that. But we want to see certainly a lot more of that and certainly benefit a lot more from the domestic supply chain and also attract inward investment, which could also be the catalyst for delivering more of this. So hopefully on that journey, how do we get from what is set out in the industrial strategy with the UK government set to get 60%, how are we going to do that? Well, two key documents, I guess, are firstly, the ScotWind offshore leasing round, which is underway, and as a few more weeks before the window closes until all the bids need to be in. Within that, companies need to provide, anybody bidding that needs to provide the supply chain development statement, which will give us set out how those that are looking to target ScotWind will actually build out their project. Now, we do entirely accept that from a lease to actually turbines going in the water, several years have passed, could pass, sorry, I should say. But it was certainly obviously allowed the early interaction between the developers and the supply chain community to actually see what is required and give plenty of time for those companies either already in this space or looking to move into this space, that they can obviously assist in the build out of that project, both working with the tier ones, which are obviously key to all of this project. For many of the developers operate down an EPCI contracting route, so the developer will not necessarily have great day-to-day running of the project. It will be very much left down to the tier ones, as many of you will know. But the other key document here is the document down in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the contract for difference process. Now, this has gone through a number of consultations over the latter part of last year, and obviously just recently announced that actually there is going to be greater implications for those developers that do not deliver on what they set out in their supply chain plan. Now, that process will be brought in for the forthcoming fourth auction round, which is due to take place at the end of the year, turn of the year. So the supply chain process of that obviously happens before that and is already starting in earnest, with many developers starting to pull together their plans for submission probably towards the autumn, late summer of this year, which will set out the stall for the projects, many of which will hopefully be in Scotland until they get into that bidding process. But the CFD and the Scotland supply chain development statements obviously need to have some teeth in them to ensure that developers actually deliver what they preach. So in the Scotland leasing round, there is certainly penalties within that, which you could ultimately sanction in the developer not taking their lease forward, or with the withdrawal of their lease rather, if they do not commit to deliver what they set out. Similar within the CFD, as many of you know, one of the key things that has been brought into that process is that their contract participants can be taken off the developer again if they do not come to fruition what they've actually set out in their supply chain plan. So in the past, we've not had the teeth to go with these, to hold people more to account, the developer community more to account. But now that we have those teeth, hopefully we'll see a lot more of the domestic supply chain being utilised, and also, as I say, inward investment hopefully coming to Scotland, which can be catalysts for the domestic supply chain to bolt onto and mushroom around and really start to stimulate, especially with obviously great opportunities coming forward. Let's say in the lead up to Scotland, with the projects that we currently have through the older round 4 schemes, etc., Scottish territorial water schemes, but also with Scotland and floating offshore wind, which will hopefully bring great benefit, not just to obviously the Scottish economy, but also to the communities around our coastline that will look to take advantage of this. So I hope that gives you a broad overview of where we are. The incoming administration are fully committed to delivering on all of this, and are really going to hold the developers and the tier ones to account. And we're very much on the same page with our UK government counterparts on this topic. So hopefully this will benefit you all going forward. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions that you may have at the session towards the end, as Ian described. Thank you very much.
Superb. Many thanks, David. We're now going to hand over to Paul O'Brien, who's going to give us an update on Deepwind and some of the activities taking place in the cluster. Paul, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. This is going to be a really quick update. We've got about 5 minutes. So just a quick update on our steering group, which consists of the 16 members you see on the screen. We have changed the makeup of how we fund the cluster, and we've moved away from public sector completely funding the cluster, and we now have a mix of the 16 members of the steering group funding the Deepwind cluster going forward. So we believe that then makes us sustainable for the future, and a big thanks to all. I can't thank ourselves, Highlands Enterprise, but I can thank the other 15 members of the steering group for anteing up to help the funding of the cluster. So great news. We also have 3 new members joining the steering group. So we have Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, Aker Solutions, and Opportunity Northeast joining the steering group. And we are now currently at 595 members. So we're just about to hit the magic 600. Not sure if that's magic or not, but it's certainly a big number. It makes us the largest cluster, offshore wind cluster in Europe. Our developer members continue to grow. We are now up at 35 members. I won't run through them all. You can see that there. So this again gives us a huge boost when it comes to industry representation, having a unique mix of every single asset owner in the UK involved in the cluster. So everybody that's got an operation wind farm, building a wind farm, or even has a site lease, we have them in the cluster. So that's a great benefit to the supply chain, having access to the top levels of the industry. And just a quick update if you've missed what's been happening in floating offshore wind. So this is the current state of play, and I'll just draw your attention to the bottom two in the list. So Pentland floating offshore wind, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and Copenhagen Offshore Partners are involved in that project. We're looking, in fact, in the next couple of weeks, we'll probably be holding an event to introduce the project and the opportunities for the supply chain around that. And of course, the other one, Salamander, was announced a few weeks ago by Simply Blue and Subsea 7, and Exodus, who are on the webinar today, are also involved in that project. So these are completely new projects, floating offshore wind, which is going to increase Scotland's prominence in the offshore wind industry, the floating offshore wind industry. And when it comes to where Cluster Builder fits into what we're actually doing, so here's a quick overview of where Deep Wind fits into working with SOWEC through the supply chain and cluster subgroup, and also through the skills subgroup, where I, on behalf of Deep Wind, sit in both of them. And the creation of the subgroups, one of the areas that we're looking at is innovation. And where does the Cluster Builder fit in? So we're looking at innovation across the whole spectrum of what the cluster does, and we're looking for the Cluster Builder to assist there. And we're also looking where we are operating with cooperation agreements and international networks through WAB in Germany, Offshore Wind in Norway, and Windoc in France. We had a recent event with Windoc just last week. So the Cluster Builder is going to assist on the development of overseas markets for the companies and getting those companies involved. So that's two areas that we'll be working closely with the Cluster Builder team. And another area is creating that bridge between academia and the cluster companies. So Cluster Builder has got a target to assist with that. So we'll be relying on the Cluster Builder team to help us with the connections, not just to these 6 existing Deep Wind members, but actually to all 13 of the universities in Scotland. So one of the first things that we'll be doing with Cluster Builder, working with them, we'll be coming out to all of the companies to do a capability mapping exercise. We're looking to create a single database for the whole of the offshore wind supply chain in Scotland. It will be accessible online. We would like it to be on the Scottish Offshore Wind portal site, because that seems to be the sensible place to have it for the whole industry, and not just linked to the clusters, but the whole of Scotland. But we need you, the members, and the members of Forth and Tay that are on as well. We need you to complete the survey and make a bit of effort so that we get the right information, which we can then use to help you guys as well. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks now.
Excellent, many thanks, Paul. We're now going to hear from David Webster from Forth Ports, who has recently been appointed chair of Forth and Tay Offshore. Okay, David, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here representing the Forth and Tay offshore cluster. We're one of the few clusters that make up the UK offshore wind sector. So yeah, I mean, I'm here to basically give a bit of an overview on what the Forth and Tay cluster is, what our vision is. We're one of 8, and really what we're here to do is we're here to help the supply chain basically build up. We're here to help the developers link into the supply chain. We're here to grow the business that's getting carried out in our coastal communities throughout our ports, infrastructure, supply chain and local government. There's a couple of things that we're doing at the moment. We've just recently appointed Scottish Engineering to help us with our cluster. So Shona is going to be joining us as a cluster manager very shortly. and hopefully that should help us support our members in a much more dynamic way. So Shona will be on as a panelist on this and should be available at the end of this to answer some questions. But I think what we've got to give a bit more of an overview on what the Forth and Tay offshore cluster actually comprises of is we've produced a little video. It's very much a work in progress, so I do apologise if anybody spots any mistakes or any omissions in it, but we're looking to build upon this as well.
Fantastic, David. That's a very snazzy presentation indeed. I think I need to up my game. We now have a very quick poll just to understand from our audience who's currently members of the clusters. As I mentioned, the Cluster Builder service will be delivering much of its activity via the clusters. So Jay is going to run a brief poll for us just now.
I'm just going to launch the poll now, thanks. And that's the poll distributing. Just a couple more seconds on this poll, and then we can show you the results.
Great, thanks, Jess. I see that 23% of participants aren't a member of either cluster, although we do have good representation, across the audience there. I'd just like to say that if you are interested in finding out more about either cluster, there's more information on the Offshore Wind Scotland website. Both clusters are completely free to join. And as I say, a lot of the cluster builder activity will be delivered via the clusters, and we'll be, making cluster members aware of all the support that's available through the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder project, primarily through the cluster newsletters. So if you'd like to know more or you're interested in joining, please have a look at the Offshore Wind Scotland website. So thanks, David and Paul, for your presentations on the clusters there. I'm now going to hand over to Lara Jurgens from Exodus Group, who's one of the market analysts, who's going to give us an overview of the launch activities of the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder project. Okay, Lara, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ian and Lindsay, as well, for all the help with the slides. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure today to, together with my colleague Elson, to introduce the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder to you all on behalf of Exodus. Now, for those of you who don't know us yet, we're a global energy consultancy. We work with a very unique and diverse group of people to share knowledge, innovate, inspire change within the energy industry. The Offshore Wind Cluster Builder is designed as a 2-year program that Exodus will be carrying out on behalf of Scottish Enterprise to really, at its heart, support, amplify the activities and efforts by the Deep Wind and Forth and Tay offshore clusters as well. And it's really at its core, as Ian mentioned, is to really create and identify growth opportunities for supply chain companies within the Scottish offshore wind industry, and particularly there to provide support to SMEs as well. And part of that will be identifying, creating those opportunities, sharing that information, disseminating it throughout the clusters and the cluster builder community, and then particularly enabling SMEs to enter as well as expand their position within the market. How is that work going to be organized? So the work is divided into 4 different work streams, essentially, through which we'll be able to support Deep Wind and Forth and Tay offshore, along the lines of the industry landscape, SME engagement, collaboration and environment, as well as stakeholder engagement as well. So for example, part of the survey that we'll be looking at today, that my colleague Elson will talk about later, as part of that industry landscape to really provide an open source initial foundation of knowledge about the current state of supply chain companies in the Scottish offshore wind sector. That could be the capabilities, but also ongoing opportunities within projects, procurement and contracting, for example, as well, and really sharing that information with the supply chain and SMEs as well. Through SME engagement, we hope to just provide a bit more one-to-one and directed support as well to supply chain companies, signposting opportunities again, but really helping as well to listen and identify some of the key challenges that are needed to really boost activity within the Scottish offshore wind supply chain. And hopefully doing that is all of that in a very collaborative and innovative environment. So collaboration and innovation are really key topics for the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder. So helping, as kind of Paul indicated already, promoting research and partnerships with academia, for example, highlighting export opportunities and facilitating and supporting some of the work that the clusters are already engaging in and will do so in the future to really make sure that those opportunities are found not just in Scotland, but overseas as well, and companies can be supported in that. But of course, none of that work would really be able to be implemented without the help and a really great network of stakeholders. That includes, of course, Scottish Enterprise, but primarily, of course, the clusters of Deep Wind and Forth and Tay offshore. So again, also a first thank you here to them for being in regular contact with us actually and supporting and promoting the work that the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder is going to be doing as well. And that's really regular engagement throughout the 2 years to continue to shape the program of the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder. Now, some of the activities that we're looking to implement and to host over the next 2 years, and as we continue to again still shape the agenda of the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder, are lined around those 4 work streams as well. So a lot of the focus here is in the next couple of months will be on initiating some of the procurement events, working with some of the developers and some of the initial stakeholders that you see here in the diagram in the figure, building on some of those existing relationships, but also making new ones and getting more developers on board here. So hosting procurement events that go beyond your traditional meet the buyer format, hopefully targeting those to be more in-depth having more conversations between SME supply chain and the various tiers and developers as well, to really help address some of the challenges and issues that are faced by the supply chain today. We're also looking to provide some of that supply chain insight. So, for example, working on contracting breakdowns and providing an overview of how key offshore wind projects in Scotland and beyond are looking to engage with their supply chain, and then also helping facilitate that engagement as well. But again, also looking to shape some of that SME one-to-one support. So again, really having those conversations, providing more in-depth support as well to companies across the next 2 years to help them within their market entry, or also to expand their position and their offering. And that also includes, of course, as Paul mentioned, really helping some of those research and innovation relationships as well, highlighting opportunities for funding calls, for innovation calls, and providing platforms where those ideas can be discussed in a very collaborative way, together with developers, tier ones across the supply chain, but particularly also for smaller and medium-sized companies as well. A key part of the cluster builder moving forward will be that engagement with companies, with the clusters, with the wider network as well. So any feedback, ideas and questions, concerns that you raise through the clusters, but that you can also raise directly with the Offshore Wind Cluster Builder, will be really, really instrumental to making this a success and continuing to build out the program of the Cluster Builder throughout the next 2 years. Events and activities will be listed through the Offshore Wind Scotland website as well, but do please continue to provide us feedback through the upcoming survey, but also through other channels, so that we can continue to build out this program and really address some of the challenges that the supply chain faces today and in future. That's it from my side. Thanks very much. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Elson, who will be able to take you through the supply chain survey.
Thanks, Lara. And hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this launch event and part of the Cluster Builder activities. So just building on what Lara has, this survey really is one of the building blocks for us to really understand where we are in this journey of developing and strengthening the Scottish supply chain for offshore wind, and what could be done next from a cluster builder point of view, but also from the point of view of any of the supporting partners to this project. It's really important to get this engagement from the supply chain from the outset with this survey, and I'm planning to explain briefly a bit more about it and how it is structured and what we're trying to get out of it, and ultimately how you could benefit from your engagement in this process. Broadly speaking, there's a couple of priorities for us with this exercise. One of it will be using that information some of that information from the survey to update the publicly available directory for the Scottish supply chain for offshore wind. You can see at the top right a reference to that website. And again, we can maybe provide that if some of you are not familiar with that space. That can be followed up in an email, the follow-up email to this launch event. Update that, and ultimately update as well the member directories of the clusters involved in this project, and also any future publicly available directories that could be built up on the basis of this information. So we would like to use that information for that purpose. The other point that we want to do is to take any general insights about the capabilities in Scotland, the experience in Scotland, and make sure that that is really used to update the narrative around offshore wind in Scotland. So this will be a chance for yourselves to let us know what is it that you're capable of doing as a company. And then we'll take a look at that information and provide a general overview and really spread the story and talk about the potential and the impact that the Scottish supply chain could have, not just in the UK, but also potentially overseas. And a final point really is to just make sure that should you be interested, we do have a way of contacting you, and the supporting partners have a way of contacting you, again, to reach out and potentially keep you up to date about some of these activities that could be in your benefit with regards to Cluster Builder, but with regards to some of the other actions that our supporting partners are undertaking to really foster and promote the Scottish supply chain. I think it covers a bit more about the structure of the survey, correct? So broadly speaking, this should take you between 10 to 20 minutes to fill in. There's 5 major sections to it, and that's based on the themes for each of the sections, but also on how the information will be used. So at the very first section, you'll have the company details. Again, this is very traditional information around who you are, so your name, address, postal code, how you classify yourselves as a company, a description of your offering, a description of your history, if you will, as well. So that kind of information. Again, this would go to the public directories and the cluster members directories as part of that. The offshore wind offer, so that would be where you could provide a bit more nuance and a bit more detail around your offering for the offshore wind sector. So this will be broken down into the different stages of a project life cycle, if you will, but also more generally speaking around all the different support activities for the sector. So there'll definitely be a category where your services, your offering is likely to relate to, and that's the only thing you have to focus on and really assert yourself as someone able to provide those services. The third one is about company capacity, track record, and scale. So this is where you can let us know a bit more about, for example, the number of professionals you have available servicing the offshore wind sector, or your ability to manufacture a specific component. So you can really dive into the details and provide a bit more information there. Track record will have to do with your experience in the sector. So you can detail how many years you've been active in offshore wind, how successful you've been securing contracts in the sector. And again, if you're less experienced in offshore wind, but you do have other relevant experiences in other sectors, there's a chance for you to bear that as well, because that is also a story that we want to tell about other competencies and other experiences that companies in Scotland can bring to the offshore wind sector. The final point on scale is really about assessing the size of your company. So that information and the other one on company perspective, those two, they would not go for the public directories that I've mentioned before. So this is more, again, about, as I mentioned in the beginning, us getting a general sense of where the sector is, where the supply chain is in Scotland, and again, what could be done next from a cluster builder point of view to really support the sector further. Company perspective would include questions around basically how you see yourselves in the sector. So is offshore wind a prioritary sector for yourselves? What sort of support do you think would be most valuable right now to really get involved and really set yourselves up in the sector? How do you see exports? Is it again a priority for yourselves, or are you more focused internally? Again, there's a number of questions really to try and gauge, not specifically your company, but just in general, how the sector is, again, directing themselves in this space. Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? How can Cluster Builder and the supporting partners have any involvement in facilitating and supporting the companies involved in offshore wind? And the final one is about company point of contact, which again, it's having a person that we can refer to, a contact email that we can refer to for verification purposes, for any clarifications around the survey, and potentially, if you're interested, again, this is for you to opt in. That could be the same person that we would engage and we would keep up to date about any future activities regarding Cluster Builder, for example, but also for the partners, the supporting partners of this survey, it could be a chance for them to share their activities, their market intelligence, and other things that could be of relevance to the companies involved. So that's very briefly a summary of the structure of the survey. And again, this survey will be launched this week, likely by Friday or Thursday. We will clarify on that in our follow-up email. Ultimately, and I think I've mentioned this in terms of the benefits, I'm just seeing the slide, sorry, but yes, I think ultimately the great benefit here is for you to have the chance to tell us your story. So tell us what you can provide to the sector. Tell us that you're involved in the sector. Tell us what are the areas where you feel support could be beneficial for yourselves, but also for the broader sector. And we can use that as a way of informing the future activities of Cluster Builder, as a way of making sure that the partners involved in this process also have that understanding and that knowledge, and they can also follow their own actions and their own activities, and making sure that everyone is channeling their efforts in the right way, the way of supporting the sector further. As I said, the survey will be launched this week, towards the end of the week. The intention is to give you a fair amount of weeks to respond to the survey, so you have until the 23rd of July to fill the survey. Highly recommend that you gather your troops, the right people you feel would have the knowledge and the capacity to respond to those different sections in the survey, as you've seen. And yeah, please do engage with it, because this will be quite a relevant process for us in terms of planning, understanding, and really try to make Cluster Builder as effective as possible in its mission to support the Scottish supply chain. You can get in touch with us in the meantime if you have any questions, if you want to clarify anything. So clusterbuilder@exodusgroup.com would be a way of getting in touch and making sure that we can address your questions or concerns. And lastly, yes, why not take this opportunity again as part of the process to engage, as Ian suggested, with the clusters, understand a bit more about what they do, what they can do to Scottish companies involved in the offshore wind sector, and potentially becoming a member of the clusters. So the clusters are quite involved in this process in the survey, as the other supporting partners that Lara has mentioned. And yeah, we're very much looking forward to see your engagement in this process. get that data, analyze it, and make our very best to make sure that the program is fit for purpose for the needs that have been highlighted in the survey, and making sure that we are telling the right stories and are building the right narratives about what is it that Scotland has to offer in regards to offshore wind. That's it from me, unless there's any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Superb, many thanks, Elson. I think in the interest of time, we'll now just go into our panel discussion session. So if we can ask our panelists to turn their cameras back on again and turn their mics on, and I'll ask a few of the questions that have been put within the Q&A box. Okey-doke. I also just want to give an opportunity to give Scott and Shona a chance to feed into this point. So I'll maybe just ask Scott. Sectors Group, you've been appointed to deliver the Cluster Builder service on behalf of SE and our partners. I just wondered, just from your perspective, over the 2-year course of the project, what are you seeking to achieve and what does success look like at the end of the project?
It is at the moment designed to be an evolving process to match the needs and the requirements of what's going to happen and what the developments will be within the industry. Initially, we want to start out as a signpost, and that's because there are multiple opportunities and options for companies to get support within the industry, from R&D grants to collaboration spaces and joint industry projects. It can be quite confusing with everything that's out there. So we want to be able to join the dots in those places, really create a sort of a network and a web of these ones, so that when companies come to us and have specific requirements of how to access the offshore wind industry, we can help them to do that. Then we want to start to build the collaboration and innovation space so that the individual offerings can start to become greater than the sum of all their parts. So we can look at what is a combined offering in certain service lines. Once companies really understand that contracting structure within the offshore wind sector, how can they work together to provide something more and start to build up from being, tier 3 and ancillary providers to maybe something slightly bigger. I'd even love to look at, what does a collaborative contracting strategy look like within the offshore wind sector? So we can look at really dealing with risk more appropriately, but that's something we all have to work on together and it's part of that evolving process. But I just love to see far more companies working in offshore wind as a first and most basic one. Any of those companies in Scotland that are competent and capable within the offshore wind market, they need to be on every list for projects that are going into construction or going through the development process. They need to make sure that they get their opportunity to partake.
Superb. Well, we've got that in video now, so we can review this at the end of the project term and figure out whether you've achieved all that. So, Shona, as I mentioned in the presentation, you are now the brand new cluster manager for Forth & Tay Offshore. Starting, is it this week, last week?
This week, I think.
This week, yeah.
We're very, very new.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on what yourself and what Scottish Engineering are looking to bring to the role of cluster manager for Forth & Tay.
No problem at all. So we're Scottish Engineering is delighted to be working with the Forth & Tay offshore cluster. As I said, it is all very new at the moment, so we're just getting to grips with things and getting to understand lots of new things for us. But just for those of you who don't know, Scottish Engineering is a membership association for engineering and manufacturing in Scotland, and so it represents a whole variety of industries across Scotland, such as aerospace, automotive, defence, renewables, marine, food and drink, digital, and all these things. So we're quite well placed and connected in with SMEs, and we've got quite a bit of experience now of managing cluster projects. We've been running the Rail Cluster project since August last year with Scottish Enterprise and Transport Scotland. And we've also recently, we've got a net zero skills cluster too. So we've got lots of experience of building up networks and collaborating, which I think will hopefully stand us in good stead with Forth & Tay Offshore. The net zero skills one, is working with Skills Development Scotland. I missed that bit. To be perfectly honest, I'm just the project lead. There's a whole team of brilliant people behind me in Scottish Engineering, including Paul Sheeran, who's the chief exec, who's on the call today. He's got no camera on. They're a great support and we'll work together on it. We're very much a collaborative, working together organisation. So I hope that'll also be a positive. Really quickly, in terms of our aspirations, and I'm very aware I'm going to be recorded, so I need to be very careful what I'm saying and make sure we can meet what I'm about to say. I think our aspirations in the first instance are to introduce ourselves to the current members in Forth & Tay and get to know all about them and where their skills lie and what their challenges are and what they're looking for in terms of support. I think we'll introduce ourselves to the sector supply chain. That's a really important part of the coin. You know, it's two sides. We've got to connect SMEs into the supply chain, so that's really important that they know who we are and we know who they are, and we've got good relationships with them. And we also want to understand all the opportunities in the sector so we can support SMEs and the supply chain too. I think we'll establish a programme of events and engage with members. I hope we'll build interest and maybe membership numbers too, if that's appropriate. And I think lastly, most importantly, we're very keen, I think I mentioned before, part of the success of the rail cluster has been about collaboration. So collaborating with Deep Wind and the offshore cluster is really important to us. We really want to work together with everybody in the sector and make this a success. So I think that's probably me.
Superb, thanks Fiona. We have got quite a few questions in the comment box. I'll maybe just ask a few from this point. Paul, you'd mentioned a couple of floating sites in the course of your presentation, but I don't think you showed them on the slides, Are you able to say more about what those projects are?
Okay, well, Salamander haven't published exactly where the site is. All I can really tell you is it's about 35 kilometres off of Peterhead, roughly, somewhere in that direction, straight out. And the other one, Pentland, is known, so that's at what was previously the Hexagon site at Dounreay. And that site will be expanded to take the bigger project up to 100 megawatts.
Superb, thanks Paul. And just maybe a quick question for David Webster. Are there any plans to expand Forth and Tay to membership from companies out with the Forth and Tay region?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're open to membership from anyone really. I mean, I think our main aim is to facilitate and help in the supply chain as much as we can, primarily focused on companies and suppliers within the Forth and Tay cluster area. But you know, as Shauna's quite right said, you know, we're open to collaborate with Deep Wind and with anybody else that wants or needs our help, basically.
Fantastic. Right, that's us at time. So I'd just like to, I think probably just close the session at this point, but I'd just like to say thanks to all our presenters. Thanks in particular as well to Jaya for hosting today's session and to Lindsay for managing the slides. I think we had quite a kind of audiovisual experience today, so it's not easy switching between polls and presentations and videos. So kind of thanks both for your help with that. To find out more about the cluster builder, as I mentioned, there'll be an email going out for everyone who signed up to this session with a link to the survey. And also there's more information on both clusters and the cluster builder project on the Offshore Wind Scotland website. So I'll pass back to Jay at this point to close the session.
Thanks very much for joining. We will be sharing the video and also the slides, and we've captured all your details. Although we didn't get all of your questions today, they've all been captured and will be shared with the panelists. So thank you very much for coming in, and we hope to see you at another webinar very soon. Thanks now. Bye-bye.